What a time to be alive it was in 1988 with the absolute wealth of horror movies that we were gifted that year. Y'all know how I feel about Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers, but that was just the tip of the iceberg, and tonight's film comes to us from 88 as well. I can remember being unreasonably excited about this movie, specifically because Billy Peltzer from Gremlins was starring in it. The question was, though, is anything in 1988's Waxwork as cute and cuddly as Gizmo? Let's talk about it. The answer was yes, just as soon as we meet the stunning China, played by Michelle Johnson. But we'll get there, though. Nothing is quite as tried and true as starting off a horror movie with a big house, dead of night, and a rainstorm going on outside. And that's what we get here. We also get a pair of brawling dudes in the living room of this house, one of which decides to bury the other one's head in the fireplace amidst a roaring fire while he goes to loot several artifacts from that house. Opening credits roll, and we get a little bit more of that hokey but somewhat fun 80s animation for the title screen. And I did not recognize a lot of the names in this cast because I was only 8 years old, but I was really hoping to see a gremlin or two come across my screen in this film. In this movie, Zach Callaghan's character name is Mark, and at the end of an awkwardly long table, he sits across from his mother while she explains to him over breakfast the difference in societal classes, us versus them, as she puts it. He's not a big fan of that concept, and he's even less of a fan of the fact that she won't give him coffee, despite the fact that he looks like he's about 23 years old in this film. But as Mark leaves for school, he has his butler Jenkins, which is a dope name for a butler, by the way, hook him up with a quick cup of java and a smoke as he goes out the door. Quick aside here, people in the 80s, and especially in this movie, they smoke like chimneys, literally lighting one cigarette off of the other before they're done. Then we get to meet the fairer sex of the film, and we happen upon Sarah, who is our innocent dove, and China, who we mentioned earlier in the film and was absolutely my crush of the late 80s. I couldn't tell you another thing Michelle Johnson was in after this movie, but she was an absolute smoke show here. Our ladies here happen upon a house that they never noticed before, and above the doorway is the word waxwork. After brief conversation between the two, they look away, look back, and there is a man standing there dressed as though he were a horse jockey that did some side work as a circus clown, very brightly colored outfit. He introduces himself as the proprietor of the waxwork and gives the girls an invitation for a midnight showing, provided, of course, that they bring no more than 6 people total. China seems intrigued by this, and she seems quite taken by this goofy-looking guy. For the life of me, I can't figure out how or why, but as a young man, it gave me a little bit of hope. Everything back in the 80s was over the top. I mean, all of it. The movie Over the Top was fantastic, but nothing is quite as over the top as Mark showing up to class and his teacher being up there screaming at the rest of the classroom with a Nazi flag behind him, all before he hands out a 20-page paper to Mark and then a 40-page paper to Mark like it's candy because he strolls into class late. Now, before we go too much further, I gotta say, there's some heavy issues with this movie in the first act, because I'm no prude, but I have no idea who's dating who in this movie. Maybe things were a little more promiscuous in the 80s than I remember as a young child, but we've got a guy showing up and he kisses a girl before the girl drapes herself all over another guy. They're all sitting in the bleachers and Mark's getting mad at China every time she looks at or mentions another swinging dick in this movie. For the dynamics of the group, they could have been just defined a little bit better, made a little more understandable. And on top of that, Zach Galligan's character, Mark, is really unbearable. And that was such a bummer to me. I mean, I remember seeing him in a Hatchet sequel later on and thinking, Jesus Christ, this guy must have forgotten how to do this. However, China is able to convince her 5 friends that the waxwork is worth their time that evening, so they set out to see it. Now, it's late, obviously it's midnight, but this is a well taken care of home in a suburban area with houses all around it, street lights, it is a perfect setting, yet these kids approach it like there is a dead body on the front lawn. I mean, they're not walking up to the Sawyer house in the middle of Texas, in the middle of nowhere. What are they so afraid of, right? Still, the ancillary couple of the group get cold feet and bounce, leaving just the four of them, Mark, Tony, Sarah, and China, to venture inside and see what there is to see. Now the gang meet a short guy, they meet a tall guy, all before they get to go in and see the exhibits. And this, for me, is where this movie gets really cool, because we go from a angsty sort of 80s film with, to be honest, some unlikable characters into almost an anthology horror film as soon as they start stumbling into these exhibits. Tony, being another chain smoker, he's trying to light another cigarette but drops his lighter, reaches over to pick it up but accidentally falls into one of the scenes. He falls into a werewolf scene, and we see that play out. Very cool how they did it. I loved the fact that everybody had their own horror story that they had to work through. Just after Tony chooses his own adventure, China winds up wandering into a vampire exhibit with a clear-cut count. He looks like Dracula in every sense. He's one of the better-looking Draculas, if we're being honest. I don't even think he was really supposed to be Dracula. But she just accepts it right away. All of a sudden, she's in this flowing white ball gown. She's descending a concrete staircase and seated at a table with what looks to be 5 other creatures of the night. She's eating raw meat from a dish, and, you know, no harm, no foul when in Rome, right? The scene bummed me out without giving it away, but China went hard in this scene, and the gown was blood red by the end of her battle, and I thought it was a really cool look. I thought visually that was badass. One of the recurring themes is the innocent and virginal Sarah being charmed and intrigued by the Marquis de Sade. She reads a book about this character. She sees this character in an exhibit when she visits the waxwork, and she's quite literally hypnotized by the exhibit and the figure on display. Mark winds up getting annoyed, luckily for her, and drags her away. Because they can't find either one of their friends, they automatically assume that they've gone ahead and left early, which pisses Mark off even more, because China can't be with Tony. China's supposed to be with him. And I get it. China's China. It isn't until the next morning that Mark calls around looking for Tony, can't find him. He calls around looking for China. She's nowhere to be seen. That's when he starts to get worried. He's still mad, but he's worried. And he realizes with the last place they were seen being the waxwork and nobody really knowing much about it, it's time to get the cops involved. Now he goes to talk to a stereotypical burnout detective, and the detective explains to him, dude, we got missing people coming out of our ears. That being said, he feels like it's a good enough reason to go and check out this waxwork. The detective makes his way inside, and he goes and checks out a Egyptian exhibit that he's drawn to for some reason. And just before the proprietor of the waxwork comes up and gives him that helpful nudge into it, the detective pulls back, bothered by something that he's seen there, and dismisses himself from the scene. Now, ultimately, we see the same cop back at his desk shortly thereafter, and he's just troubled about something. He sees faces in his images from the waxwork that he knows he's seen before, and he starts to realize those are the faces of the missing people that I've been investigating. Makes a decision, a dumb decision, to go back to the waxwork by himself, sneak in, try to get some more tangible evidence of what's going on there to possibly try to link them to the missing persons that he's been dealing with. As it so often does, trouble finds him, and he winds up in the exhibit that he was looking at just hours prior, coming face to face with a very nasty looking mummy. Now Mark and Sarah know something bad's happened to our friends, and they're certain that the waxwork is at the center of it all. When Mark finds a newspaper clipping in the attic of his house that ties the guy that owns the waxwork to the death of his grandfather, they seek out an expert. I don't know where they found this expert, but they find an expert on this whole thing, right? This guy explains to him the reasoning behind the owner of the waxwork killing his grandfather and the 18 artifacts that were in turn stole from Mark's grandfather. Those artifacts being the center of these different waxwork exhibits. And I popped for the explanation of each exhibit being a ghost in and of itself, not just the characters contained within the exhibit, but the entire exhibit is an entity. I thought that was a really cool way of explaining that. He also explains to them that every time the exhibits take a life, they're that much closer. So if the 18 exhibits take 18 lives, everything within the waxwork is going to be unleashed on the world, thus bringing the world to an end. There were a few things in these exhibits that they look like if you let them loose on the Walmart on my west end of town, it wouldn't last 5 seconds. There are way scarier things at the Walmart in the west end of town than there are in this movie. Mark and Sarah race off, and then this expert makes a mysterious phone call explaining to whoever he's talking to, it has begun, which is an overused phrase. I think of Mortal Kombat when I hear it. The plan, as they've laid it out, is burn down the waxwork, especially burning down the exhibits that have not yet killed people. That's key. That way they can never be utilized for evil again. And I laugh so hard when I see Mark and Sarah roll up to this place with 2 little cans of lighter fluid and a little Bic, expecting to burn down this giant brick building. Too funny. Now, the ending was better than most of the film, and it almost felt like we got Billy Peltzer in this scene because he just seemed a little more fun-loving. He seemed a little less serious, but he was getting after it and taking care of business because we had a Pier 6 brawl. It turns out the expert has called in the cavalry, and even though the exhibits all come to life because they've claimed their 18 bodies, everybody's going to war with them. And it was very entertaining. It was very cool how the whole thing sort of came together. The effects here aren't half bad, and we get a little bit of a tug at the heartstrings because the friends that they've lost to these exhibits are now part of the exhibits, and they come back to try to trick their friends into joining them. I liked this movie a lot as a kid. I don't like it as much as an adult. I'm going to give it a 5.5 out of 10. For me, that's not good enough to age gracefully. I was sitting there thinking about it the other day, and I don't know when I'll watch this movie again, if I'll ever sit down and watch this movie again. And it's not because there aren't cool aspects of it. The idea in and of itself is cool. The thought of it, I love anthology series, and like I said, when they start to get into these exhibits and they're having their own terrifying adventures, that's when the movie gets really good. But unfortunately, the cast wasn't super likable. Mark, aka Zach Galligan, aka Billy Peltzer, we love you, not great in this movie. Just real grumbly, real hit and miss. For me, it was a letdown, and I don't know that I'll ever put this on my television again, but I appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you fine folks about it. If you haven't seen it, I mean, there's worse things you can do with 90 minutes of your life. I'm Matt Essex. This is Aging Gracefully. I appreciate you guys.